So very, very happy to introduce our next speaker now, Adam Curtis. It's a great pleasure to introduce Adam again. He was participating last year in our marathon. It was the great finale, and again today it's part of the great finale of these two days of marathon. We will have Adam Curtis presenting two films. Adam is such a big influence on many artists. His documentaries have an enormous impact on the art world related to memory and history. He's using this extraordinary archive of the BBC. As he told once in a conversation, he sits on top of the world's biggest, richest, and most wonderful archive, a record of the past more than 80 years. And this whole idea of memory and archive is an important topic of many of the films. Curtis makes political and historical documentary films for the BBC, including The Mayfair Set, The Century of the Self, on the Freud dynasty and the management strategies of mass consumerism, or in 2004, The Power of Nightmares, on the politics of fear. There is also The Trap, What Happened to Our Dream of Freedom, 2007, on a modern concept of freedom, and All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, in 2011, on how computers have led us into a simplified machine vision of the world. His films have won many awards, including 6 BAFTAs, and we recently collaborated together on a retrospective of all his films at eFlux in New York, where his work was shown in the context of the art world, and Adam kept emphasizing that I should not call him an artist, but a journalist. So it's important to make that point again tonight. Adam will show us 2 films which he will introduce. On the one hand, it's one of the parts of The Living Dead related to memory. The Living Dead is in 3 parts. On the Desperate Edge of Now, You Have Used Me as a Fish Long Enough, and The Attic. The film being shown here is the second part, I think. You Have Used Me as a Fish Long Enough. And then the second film he's going to show us is the first film ever made on Scientology. A very, very warm welcome to Adam Curtis.
Thanks very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm obsessed by politics and power. It's a journalist thing. So what I want to talk about tonight is how memory, or human memory, got mixed up with politics and power in the recent past, above all in the Cold War. What I want to talk about in this short time is the story of what was known as brainwashing. It's a very recent idea. It was actually invented in 1951. At the heart of it is the belief that science somehow had found a way to wipe human memories and replace them with new implanted memories, which means that human beings could become essentially like automatons, robots, manipulated by those implants. I want to tell the story of that. It's a phenomenon of the paranoia and the fear of the Cold War. But as the result of some rather disastrous experiments, basically by the 1960s, that idea of brainwashing was shown to have been failed, to be untrue, basically, scientifically. You couldn't do it. But that's not the end of the story. Because what then happened to the idea of brainwashing and the idea of changing people's memories and mind control mutated into something very, very strange, which it's become to possess our imagination. I want to argue, has come to possess our imaginations today. It's a powerful belief that individuals' minds can be manipulated and controlled by cults, strange new religions, odd extreme political parties. We see things through that prism, and I want to try and show how that has happened. And what I want to argue is that although there is actually no scientific evidence now for the idea that brainwashing can actually happen, that we're actually far stronger, far more sophisticated as human beings than that, it's got very deep into our social conditioning, if you might call it, which has led us, all of us, liberals, conservatives, whatever you want to say, to be very suspicious and fearful of new ideas, of new ways of looking at the world. It's become a sort of block. And I want to just tell the story of how that has risen up and then come back to that idea of it being, in a way, a form of censorship. Now, just briefly, to tell you the brief history of the origins of the idea of brainwashing, it was actually invented by a journalist, an American journalist called Edward Hunter, back in 1951 during the Korean War. And if we could just show the first still, he wrote a book called Brainwashing, actually, and it was all about how prisoners in the Korean War, American prisoners of war, were making extraordinary confessions, which were totally unexpected, and also going on camera and saying they believed in communism. Hunter argued that what this was really a result of was this thing called brainwashing, that the Chinese and the Soviets, he said, had found a way of actually removing people's memories and replacing them with other memories. This is what the Manchurian Candidate, that film, was about. He was the first man to argue this. It became very, very powerful as an idea in the Cold War. And then the CIA decided, well, if the Chinese can do it and if the Russians can do it, can we do it? So they decided to set out to do it. And they then found this man, very ambitious psychologist, called Ewan Cameron, who was up in an institute in Montreal. And he had also become fascinated by this idea of brainwashing for very different reasons from the CIA. He had an idea that you could somehow make new kinds of beings if you could get rid of the terrible memories from their past that was causing them such pain and such neurotic angst. If you could wipe those and replace them with new memories, they could become better, happier, new kinds of people. Now, the CIA didn't quite see it like that. What they wanted was people who could become new kinds of weapons, who could have implanted memories, they could send them off to the Soviet Union, they could do all sorts of spying sort of stuff, but would never be detected because their memories, which were shaping and controlling them, they thought were real. So these two people came together, and they set out to do these extraordinary experiments, which Cameron called psychic driving. And I just want to show you a section from the film that Hans Ulrich talked about, that I made, about this. It's about how those experiments happened, what he tried to do, how he tried to actually, and he did successfully, wipe the memories. There's an individual who I interviewed, wiped her memories completely. What he found it very difficult to do was to then put new memories back in. That's where it began to go wrong. So if we could just show the first clip, please. As you can see, the experiments ended, I mean, she was only one of quite a lot, it ended in complete disaster because what they found is they just couldn't put new memories back, that the idea was scientifically untrue. And the CIA people and the defense establishment, I've talked to them about it, realized that this was just rubbish and that what they were being sold by psychiatrists was a simplified view of what the relationship between human beings and memories is, that human beings are almost like recording machines into which memories are slotted and then new ones can be doing. So they gave up on it, but a lot of psychiatrists didn't. They're an ambitious lot of psychiatrists, and they still believed in it. And what then began to happen was that they were going to get another chance to apply that theory of brainwashing to something completely different. Because at that time in America, end of the 60s, what was emerging were what were called new charismatic religions, fringe religions, all sorts of new movements coming out of the hippie street people movement above all in San Francisco. What these religions did was take a lot of the children of the middle class and the upper middle class of America away from their parents and take them into a completely new world. Some of them were straight religious groupings, like there was, I think, what was called the Jesus people. Others were quasi-religious, like Est, or above all, the one that became most notorious was Scientology. What the parents were shocked by was how their nice, well-brought-up, hippie children, but still nice hippies, suddenly transformed into completely alien beings. There was a massive movement amongst rich, well-connected parents to try and stop this, because what was happening was that it was almost like their children were being taken away from them and turned into something else and believing something else and never wanted to come home. They just stayed with these they were just called new religions at that point. Although the parents made a lot of noise about it, they didn't really have much effect until, in the wake mostly of the Patty Hearst kidnapping and then the Jonestown suicides in 1978, the psychiatrists got involved. And they were the psychiatrists who had worked mostly interrogating the prisoners from Korea back in the 50s. They got involved. And they came to the parents and they said, we can explain what this is all about. Your children are being brainwashed. And these cults, this is where they started to use the word cult. These cults are using exactly the same techniques as the Chinese and the Soviets doing. The central figure was a woman called Margaret Singer. She'd interviewed prisoners of war back in the 50s, and she became central to what was called the Cult Awareness Network, and who argued that really what was happening to your children was they were being turned into manipulated robots with implanted new ideas in them. They weren't really in control. Now, I want to show you just a brief bit from a film. I mean, it's really an excuse to show it, because I stumbled upon it in the BBC archives the other day. It's the earliest documentary made about Scientology, before all the hysteria. I mean, it's still quite critical, but before all the hysteria grew up. It's made in 1971. You'll get a sense of how the explanations of people like Margaret Singer fitted with this idea of brainwashing, that really what was happening inside, what Scientology was offering, was this idea of a new form of controlling your mind, taking the bad stuff out of your mind, managing and controlling those bad things in your mind so you can become a better, more complete person. And you can see, I just want to show you a clip from it, that it is very much this idea that you could become a new kind of person by changing the bad things in your mind, removing some of them, very like Ewan Cameron, in fact, in those experiments you've just seen. I just want to show you this second clip, please. I have absolutely no idea why conservatism is seen as the sort of the supreme point you get to, and that's sort of been lost in the history of Scientology. I just love it because it's innocence about the whole hysteria of Scientology. Out of people like Margaret Singer and the psychiatrist saying to the parents, your children are being brainwashed, came this thing called the Cult Awareness Network. It started all sorts of legal challenges in the American courts, and to an extent here, but mainly in America, arguing that these young people were being brainwashed. What also began to emerge from it was what was called deprogramming, where you would go and kidnap people from these cults or new religious movements and forcibly coerce them into a program where you were trying to break through these false memories that had been implanted in them in order to bring them back to what was real. And some of it was quite, I am told, quite violent and quite intrusive. This became quite big in the 80s, and what then happened in the academic world of psychiatry and psychology was a big reaction, and it's a fascinating story. I've stumbled upon it. A lot of psychiatrists and psychologists decided that their counterparts who were supporting the Cult Awareness Network were wrong. That they were, again, off on this brainwashing theory, and there was no evidence for it. And there was this massive, massive battle that went on in the 80s within the academic world. First of all, what they said about people like Margaret Singer is she's not showing any evidence of how these people are being brainwashed. You're saying it, and it seems to be like that, and they go off and they do very weird things, like in Scientology, but you're not actually showing us any evidence. But then came a killer report, which is really interesting. It's done by two rather mild-mannered academic psychologists called Dr. Lewis and Dr. Bromley. Because they worked out that Margaret Singer, who was saying that people were being so damaged by this brainwashing, had only ever studied people who had been kidnapped and forcibly deprogrammed. What she hadn't studied was this other group, who are much bigger, of people who had voluntarily left cults or new religious movements, whatever you want to call them. So she'd studied this small group over here of forcibly deprogrammed people and said, look at the damage, look at the neuroses that have been created in them. She hadn't studied this group. So what Dr. Lewis and Dr. Bromley did, quite sensibly, was to go and find a big enough sample that represented this lot and that lot, the people who had voluntarily left and those who had been deprogrammed. What they found was extraordinarily dramatic. If you're an academic psychologist, it's very dramatic. It was that really only in the group who had been deprogrammed, and above all in those forcibly deprogrammed, was there sign of psychological trauma and neurosis, hurt or harm. In the overwhelming majority of those who had voluntarily left these cults and these sects or whatever they are, there was no harm. most of them apparently thought that it had made, the experience might have been a bit odd, but it had made them wiser and given them a better perspective on society. So Dr. Lewis and Dr. Bromley made a very simple conclusion out of this, which was then supported by a lot of other studies that followed on, that it possibly might not have been the new religious movements that were causing the problem, it was the deprogramming. That was their shocking conclusion, and it rocked the academic world, and it caused an immense row. I mean, we don't hear about it because most people don't report on what happens in the academic world, but it's a great story, and they all hated each other. I mean, it was just went berserk. And it ended in the end of the 80s by the American Psychological Association, who are the leading body for psychologists, issuing a legal statement saying that the idea of brainwashing as applied to these cults had absolutely no scientific effect whatsoever. Unfortunately, immediately after that came the siege at Waco, and all the journalists started talking about brainwashing all over again. But by the end of the 80s, yet again, there was no scientific evidence for this. And then it was revealed by a historian, if we could just have that still again of brainwashing, that study by Mr. Hunter. Mr. Hunter was a journalist, but he was also actually, as was quite common in the early 1950s, a CIA agent. This was a piece of black propaganda. He'd made it up. The Chinese had been putting out their own black propaganda, saying the American prisoners in our prisoners of war camps are all converting to communism. So he decided to write a book saying the only reason for this is because they found this diabolical new way of manipulating human minds. There was no evidence for it. In effect, it was a hoax. That was then revealed. Now, the point about why he wrote that is the key to all this. The idea of brainwashing and the implanting of false memories was a way for Americans in the Cold War to defend themselves against that frightening idea that people within your own society, people that live next door to you, might actually believe something completely different from you, and something that was dangerous, and something that would be communism. It was a way of defending against that. It explained how that wasn't real, because they were implanted beliefs. And the same was true for all those parents of the children who went off to join the cult. Because that was a time when the generations were at war with each other to an extent, much more so than now. The children were challenging the beliefs of their parents. Very much sort of a Cold War between generations. And the role of brainwashing and the cults was to have the same defensive explanation against the frightening idea that your children might believe in something voluntarily that is completely different from what you believe in. They didn't really. The psychiatrists proved they had been brainwashed. Now, although that idea is now scientifically disproved, what I want to finish by saying is that this idea, I think, still persists very deeply in our society. Firstly, the idea of cults and brainwashing is I mean, I know this because I'm a journalist, as Hans Ulrich said. Journalists like the idea of cults and brainwashing, and they apply it to everything. I mean, they even apply it to Islamism or false memory syndrome. Throughout the 90s, it's become a very convenient journalistic and political explanation. But I think there's something much deeper that's come out of this, which is simply this, is that what's emerged out of this idea that human beings can be manipulated and given new ideas and new memories is a vision of human beings as fundamentally weak, as vulnerable psychologically, that their minds can be manipulated, that, in a sense, all of us can easily become victims. It's a weak, passive, and essentially negative idea of human beings. I think it's got very deep into our society. I think it comes out of things like this. It morphs through the CIA and all those experiments. It comes then through Cult Awareness Network and all those dramatic stuff that grabbed the pages in the 80s. And it's essentially a negative, vulnerable idea of human beings. What's disappeared in the face of that is an idea of human beings as essentially confident individuals who can be inspired by new ideas and new ways of looking at the world, which may seem mad to the majority, but voluntarily go and try and experience them and learn from them and not be hurt by them. I mean, they may be mad, but just be strong. It's the loss of strength that I think has come out of this. Now, I'm not in any way defending things like Scientology. Please don't get me wrong. They may well be completely coercive, mad, nutty, and they want to take money off you, as many people allege, or they may not be. I have to be careful in these circumstances. But I'm not trying to defend that. What I'm talking about is a more general principle that comes out of this simplistic, simplified idea of memory, which is what the application of it as a general principle is, if it explains everything like cults or new religions as simply psychological manipulation of us as weak, vulnerable beings, what it does is it pathologizes anything that's new. So if anything new that comes along, it simply says, you're being manipulated. See, you're being manipulated into believing that. You're deviating from the correct way of thinking, which is the norm. I mean, that's what deprogramming was all about. It was about trying to get rid of that bad stuff and bring you back to being normal. And I think that actually risks making deviations from the norm, which are new ideas, seen as pathological and dangerous. And I think that in itself is dangerous, because it prevents us from seeing that there are other systems of thought out there in the world. Groups that people might join and believe in voluntarily, because they offer an exciting, imaginative alternative to the rather rigid and rather narrow world we live in today. I mean, I do think that it's this idea, we live in a very rigid society that isn't moving forward, and I think this is not the only mechanism, but this is one of the mechanisms, this idea that we are weak, vulnerable, and prey to having what is in our minds tampered with, that is somehow in the water at the moment. I mean, I know as a journalist, it's there. It's a weak vision of ourselves. And who knows, some of those weird things out there, those weird groups, those weird cults, may sometime offer a real genuine way to the future. Christianity was a cult. Marxism was a cult. Capitalism is a cult. It's almost as if we've been brainwashed to disbelieve in radical alternatives about the future. But as we know, brainwashing doesn't exist. Thank you very much.